Okay, it's June 4th, 2007, and I'm Barbara Garrity Blake talking to Mr. Joe Smith at the NOAA lab. Okay, let's start off with some background information, Joe. Can you tell me about what your specialty is here at NOAA?
I handle the fishery-dependent data for the Menhaden fisheries. Fishery-dependent data is three large data sets: the catch records, the daily offloads, if you will, of the Menhaden vessels, the offloads at the factories. Also, I manage the port samplers that go down to the boats daily, get a sample of fish from the boats. From that sample, they take a subsample and they measure for the fish for length, weight, and they pull a scale patch. We can tell how old the fish are from the scale patch, not unlike reading rings on the trees, annual rings on the trees. We read semicircular rings on scales to tell how old the fish are. You can take those first two data sets, merge them together. We know the weight of the total weight of fish that came across the dock from the catch records. From the port samples, we know how many age 1s and 2s came across the dock for a given week. From that, we can estimate how many 1s, 2s, 3s were caught for a given week, sum over all fish factories for the entire year, and we have an estimate of how many age 1s, 2s, 3s were taken by the fishery. That information goes to the guys we call the numbers crunchers, the stock assessment guys, and they periodically do assessments, stock assessments on the health or well-being of the stock, what we think's going on out in the ocean, how many fish are actually out there, mortality rates, recruitment of young fish, get information like that. The third big data set I handle is it's essentially daily logbooks. Every Menhaden vessel has a daily log sheet on the deck, and the captain itemizes whenever they make a purse seine set. They itemize the time they started the set, when they finish, how many fish they estimate they caught in the set, and a location, and a couple other fields in there. But for every set, it's recorded, and the data comes to us here, me in particular. So that's the third big data set I handle. And a lot of that information, like I said, goes to the stock assessment guys at the end of the year.
Okay. And how many years have you been doing this?
Since 1983. So this will be going on 25 years, I guess.
Wow.
So.
But the Menhaden program has existed even longer than that, right?
Menhaden research started in earnest here in Beaufort in 1955. There was some preliminary work done in 52 through 55, but during that preliminary work, the researchers realized that this truly was a coastal stock, and that no one state could sample and get a handle on what was going on in the coast-wide stock. So it became apparent after those first three preliminary years that probably the feds would have to get into it and study the coast-wide stock from. In 55, the Beaufort lab got into Menhaden research in earnest, and it was actually at the behest of the Menhaden industry. The people that ran or owned companies in the Atlantic Menhaden fishery at the time wanted someone to explain to them why there were various cycles in abundance and scarcity up and down the coast. In other words, why did fish show really good in Virginia and Jersey, say, one year, and then there was a scarcity of fish, say, in New England at the same time, and then kind of a reversal of this a couple years down the road. So the industry, it seems a little bit odd in this day and age, but it was at the behest of the industry that the feds got into Menhaden research. And so in 55 it started in earnest, and we had port samplers strung from northern Florida, Fernandina Beach, on up into the Gulf of Maine, southern Maine. And initial questions were literally basic things about the life history and biology of menhaden. How old do they get? How old are they when they first spawn? How often do they spawn? Where do they spawn? Just basic things like that, and then movements and distribution. So the first probably couple decades, 20, 25 years, was basic biological research. That was kind of dovetailed probably in the mid to late 60s with wanting to know more information on migratory routes and recruitment. So there was a lot of tagging efforts, over 1 million Atlantic menhaden tagged in those years, 60s through the 70s, I guess. Probably one of the most successful tagging of herring-like fish, maybe in the world, certainly in North America. And then from the tagging, there was a little spin-off from the tagging. We did some juvenile abundance research, where trying to get a handle on incoming year classes for the industry so that they might prepare for, say, a dominant year class coming through the fishery, maybe a couple years down the line, sampling the age zeros, if you will, and trying to predict that when they might be abundant and where 1 or 2 years down the line when they become 1 and 2 year old fish.
So they would prepare in knowing where they're likely to show up, but they don't really change mesh sizes, do they? Do they?
Not the fishery has changed a little bit based on some state regulations. Virginia regs are the smallest mesh size they can use up there is 7/8 inch bar. In North Carolina, you can use a slightly smaller bar, 3/4 of an inch. Mm-hmm. Hence, Virginia nets or bay nets versus Carolina nets. And Carolina nets were used pretty much in the fall when the small age zeros come down the beach, and the industry, at least in the late 70s and through the mid 80s, would concentrate on often on the peanuts or age zeros, and they'd be able to switch over once they fished in North Carolina waters to the quote Carolina nets. Mm-hmm. But the juvenile abundance was we were pulling midwater or topwater trawls, if you will, surface trawls, for schools of juvenile or age zero menhaden, and try and get a handle on their abundance and then predict what their abundance might be down the line a couple years hence as age 1s and 2s. And so that was phased out probably in the mid 80s, I guess. Since about the late 80s, what we've been in is pretty much a monitoring phase. We've lost, in the 50s, we've literally had dozens of people here working on menhaden. We're now since about 2000, we're pretty much, like I said, monitoring, myself handling most of the fishery dependent data, and then port agents out there sampling the fish, and a couple of techs here to handle the data, one of which reads all the scales for the aging, but pretty much, again, fishery-dependent data coming in, not the fishery-independent data, which the tagging and the juvenile abundance stuff would have been.
So is that because of budget cuts?
Mostly, yeah, true.
Yeah.
Good point. Mostly budget and money's going elsewhere.
Yeah. That's too bad, because fisheries-dependent data, to be wholly reliant on that while the fishery seems to be declining with less participation, that kind of puts the program in a bind, doesn't it?
Yeah, in retrospect, I think a lot of people would give eye teeth to have that juvenile survey and the tagging survey still going. The juvenile abundance information has been it's been pointed out that that's one of the weaker points of the most recent stock assessments. We now rely on state seine surveys to give us estimates of juvenile menhaden abundance up and down the coast. There's about 5 states that do seine surveys, but these surveys are ostensibly for other animals. In Maryland and Virginia, they're for striped bass. In New England, they're for other herrings. But they count all the fish, so we get the data. But beach seines are not the best gear to catch juvenile menhaden. We think surface trawls are probably the best. So it's the best available data we have for the juvenile surveys. But in retrospect, we'd have liked to keep those, not only the tagging but the juvenile survey work. If that could have been going, it would have filled some gaping holes in the assessments.
Yeah. Well, from the perspective of NOAA, would you say that menhaden is the most thoroughly researched and monitored fishery, given when, the point in history that it started and the effort that's been put into it?
Certainly on the East Coast and the northern Gulf of Mexico, yes. There's probably some other species who may have some data sets that are longer on the West Coast, maybe Pacific halibut and maybe the cow coffee studies in Southern California. But certainly menhaden ranks up there is one of the best data sets in the U.S. I often hear the stock assessment people just reveling in the abundance of data we have. They I don't want to say enjoy, but they would prefer to work with the menhaden data sets than some of the other species where there's some gaping holes in the data. You have to fill voids and make tremendous amount of assumptions with the patchy data they get. With menhaden, it's been continuous. Fishery's been sampled the same way for over 50 years now. So on the Atlantic coast, and we also do the same thing, I might add, for the Gulf Coast. We've been sampling the Gulf Coast based on the same sampling design on the Atlantic on the Gulf since '64.
Wow.
So tremendous amount of data.
And is this office the headquarters, or?
Yeah, I handle the fishery dependent data, but we've got a couple of stock assessment guys here, and yes, this is where the menhaden the research for the fishery service is done out of Beaufort.
Okay, but then you have people working in Reedville.
We have port agents distributed where the fish factories are, and the extant fish factories now on the East Coast. There's only one, Reedville, Virginia. It's at the mouth of the Potomac River, that neck of land between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, just that northern neck by Smith Point. Reedville's right there with 10 vessels this year. On the Gulf Coast, there's still 4 factories left, going from west to east. Cameron, Abbeville, Empire, Louisiana, and Moss Point, Mississippi, and roughly 10 vessels for each factory. I think they're sporting or fielding about 42 vessels down on the Gulf this year.
Okay. So, what was the impact of Beaufort Fisheries closing on your work here?
Well, from a coast-wide perspective, from the fisheries perspective, Beaufort Fisheries landed on the order of 20 to 30,000 metric tons of fish a year. That would, on some years, represent 15–18% of the coast-wide landings of the Atlantic coast. Now, that may not seem a lot, but considering 80% of that figure was probably landed between November and January, say 3 months of the year. It's pretty remarkable landings for this little area in that little amount of time, coming from that small factory with not a high capacity down there and only a couple of vessels. So It was it was very important relative to the coastwide landings of Atlantic menhaden for reduction. It certainly had an impact when you look at regional fishery landings in the southeast U.S. Some of I'm thinking of the fishery statistics of the U.S. books that come out annually, and they break out total fishery landings by region. And if you look at the southeast region, when after Beaufort Fisheries closed winter 2004-2005, the 2005 landings by region Atlantic southeast Atlantic landings plummeted, as did the North Carolina landings, because a tremendous amount of that poundage was in menhaden. So that had an effect on I think on a way some of the research monies are parsed out within the state and maybe the southeast. But it certainly here in Beaufort, it was we had a full-time sampler here dedicated to sampling Beaufort fisheries, and that person's gone on to other duties now. And it was a big part of my life, just going down there to the factory, and you'd learn a tremendous amount of about what was going on in the Virginia fleet and coast-wide in the fishery from the captains, the spotter pilots, the owner of the factory down there. You knew about fleet movements, you knew about large concentrations of fish, you could get a handle on incoming year classes based on observations of the fishermen and the spotter pilots. So it's tremendous amount of input that we've lost that way, at least from a fishery dependent perspective.
Did you or any of your assistants go out on the vessels?
We'd go out periodically, but again, our main thrust was meeting the boats at the dock to sample the fish, the daily catch, and we'd take a sample from the top of the fish hold, and that was assumed to be the last purse seine set of the day. They would pump one set on top of another. So, but I periodically did go out with them. And even when he had the sound boats, which were just the little day boats that would go out into sound boats, because they would mainly fish Core Sound, Back Sound, maybe Bogue Sound, fish inshore waters back in the 80s when I first got here. And Wheatley had several of them. Sea and Sound Processing had one, the Hush Puppy. But they were daily boats, and they would come in usually by early mid-afternoon. But they didn't land tremendous amounts of fish, but they kept the factory going during the summer. They kept the crews together. They kept the plant people together, the factory running and well greased, kind of, so to speak. And all in anticipation for the fall run of fish that would come down, usually 1st of November or so. It would migrate down the ocean beaches. That's when the real fishery would start here.
Right.
So
how would you characterize the relationship between scientists and the fishing industry for menhaden?
I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. In my experience, I've been in fisheries since '75, and I'm in a very unique situation, and menhaden industry and fishery is kind of unique in that the industry actually wants us on the docks sampling. They give us pretty much unrestricted access to the factories, to their catches, to their vessels to acquire the catch information and the port samples, I have extremely good access to the unloads and the unloading information, the catch weighouts, if you will, and then the daily log books are all voluntary. It's not, up until a couple years ago, there was no mandatory provision for those, and they feel there's 100% compliance by the vessel captains on filling these daily log books out, and they religiously send them to us every other week, in biweekly installments. I'm told that the captains aren't paid until they hand in their week's worth of logbooks. So it's to me it's unprecedented. The fishery actually wants us out there sampling. I think early on the Menhaden fishery decided and were savvy enough to realize that they were going to be managed, and I tell people I think they realized that and realized that they'd prefer to be managed with good data versus bad data or no data, and I think in the long run it has helped them out in that there've been times when the stock was really in trouble, but there's also been times when they've been vindicated by the assessments, because by virtue of having 50 years of solid data to rely on. So,
Right.
So again, it's kind of been a unique relationship from the perspective of a fishery and a fisheries management agency.
Yeah, and so I wonder, it seems like there's been good trust, and that is not necessarily the case in several other fisheries that are managed by National Marine Fisheries Service that might send observers out. What I've noticed, my impression is that relationships in certain fisheries have actually gotten worse throughout the years, and that some fishermen are loath to participate anymore because they don't believe the correct data is being taken or the data is not being used properly. The recent snapper grouper Amendment 13C situation, certain fisheries like that. And so sometimes I wonder, why has it been such a success story with Menhaden and not these other fisheries?
And there's not. It's not only been the feds that there's been animosity against. There's also state agencies,
Yeah.
But again, we've had pretty much unrestricted access to the data, to the vessels, and it's a very unique situation. It hasn't always been peachy and rosy. There's been some testy times here, but the industry stood by that early maxim that they wanted the feds to step in and do the comprehensive monitoring up and down the coast. So
and maybe one difference is because they do have sort of a company directive and company decision making versus individual fishermen in the snapper grouper fishery, etc. that will have experience.
Yeah, just I'm glad you brought that up, because Menhaden is a bit unique in that it's vertically integrated. The companies own not only the nets, the boats, the purse boats, in some instances the spotter pilots, some instances the trucks they haul the product away to markets in. So it's not your traditional mom and pop owner operator U.S. fishery like the shrimp fishery or the snapper groupers or king mackerel fishery. So you're only dealing with currently just two companies. Omega Protein and Daybrook Fisheries are the only extant companies. So in that respect, you're dealing with two entities, and they own the vessels, and so there is a lot of managerial oversight by the plant managers, and that get us the access to the data.
Two companies in all of the Atlantic and Gulf.
Yes, so Omega Protein is the big player. If you trace their roots back, they're the old Zapata, Zapata Haney. And renamed, I think, in probably '99 as Omega Protein. But they own the only factory on the East Coast at Reedville, Virginia, and then they own 3 of the 4 on the Gulf Coast. They own Cameron and Abbeville, Louisiana, and Moss Point, Mississippi. The only independent left, I call them independent, left in the fishery, is Daybrook Fisheries at Empire, Louisiana, down the Mississippi River, down towards Venice down the near the mouth of the Mississippi. And they were a merger of the old Petru Company and Wallace Fisheries. So that's Daybrook. They're privately owned. Omega is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, OME.
Mm-hmm. So was Daybrook sort of more akin to Beaufort Fisheries then?
Yeah, they're family owned. Both families can trace their roots back almost. I know one family, the Wallace family, can certainly go back 100 years in the Menhaden business. Probably the Petru family also. More akin to the Beaufort Fisheries and the Wheatley family, although Daybrook used to have a presence on the East Coast. Now they've consolidated down to the Gulf Coast, and they are much bigger. It's a bigger factory with 10 or 11 vessels down there. Mm-hmm. But in the vein of an independent, yeah, they're the only ones left.
Right. Well, in your experience in working with the captains and the fishermen, do you notice any differences in the way fishermen view the natural environment versus the scientific community?
Fishermen are true believers in cycles, I think, and everything's cyclical, and I can see some of that looking into the Menhaden data. I see decadal cycles, at least on the Atlantic. The boom years were in the 50s, big downturn in the 60s, probably due to poor recruitment for whatever reasons of young fish into the stock, rebuilding in the 70s, 80s, a little bit of a decline in the 90s, and we may be on the cusp of a little rebuilding trend now. So I think we're in line in that we see cyclical things going on. Maybe their cycles are a lot shorter in duration than ours. I see things in terms of decadal cycles, at least on the Atlantic. So from that respect, I think we're a lot similar. I think they are savvy enough to know that there's this recreational, commercial angst going on in the last couple decades with recreational interests flexing their muscles, mostly in the managerial arenas, and there's a lot of animosity on the commercial side because essentially the Menhaden industry has been shut out of just all states except Virginia and North Carolina. Can't fish in any of the territorial seas north of Virginia or south of North Carolina without tremendous amount of restrictions. So yeah, we see things alike in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Do you think there's much chance that the industry will continue on for quite some time? I mean, have they reached sort of this critical point where now they're going to, what we do have, we'll be able to maintain, or do you still see this sort of push to, reduce the fishery?
Yeah, with one factory left on the East Coast, and they're under assault in various ways. The easiest one to discuss is just this, what I think the sociologists call it, waterfront gentrification. The waters, or the property that the factory is on, is necessarily waterfront property, and it's become more valuable for land development, condos, boat stacks, dry stacks, marinas, than it is for traditional uses, boat yards, fish factories, fish houses. We're seeing that at Beaufort Fisheries happen. That'll probably be developed in a few years as some coastal development. Reedville, I used to think, was down Northern Neck as far as you could go, about as far as you could get away from the Baltimore-Washington megalopolis, go southeast and still be away from it and not run out of land. But that's caught up to them. Retirees, second homeowners, waterfront property, not unlike North Carolina coast, the Virginia property has escalated tremendously, and I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball, but they're getting impacted up there by developments just kind of hedging in closer and closer to the factory. And let's face it, it's a fish factory with smoke and various effluents. It ain't pretty, but it used to be out there by itself in the soybean fields, but not any longer.
Yeah, and how about on the Gulf?
The Gulf is those factories are pretty far down the bayou. I mean, the Empire is about as far south as you can get down the mouth of the Mississippi without leaving land. And Abbeville and Cameron are way down there also. Moss Point is a little bit different in that they're on Mississippi Sound, and the two counties to the west of them is where Biloxi, Gulfport area is, with all the casinos that have been in there moved in there the last 4 or 5 years. So they get this development from the west. There's been some concern about the fish factory being there and the boats fishing that close to a coast that's dedicated to recreation and entertainment. So there's some regs that the boats have to stay off a mile or so, but it's a fish captain's worst nightmare is having a fish spill, a net tear on a big weekend on a Biloxi beach kind of thing. So yeah, they're feeling the impact of coastal development on the Gulf, but it's not as acute, I don't think, as it is up in Virginia. And of course, the other big controversy on the East Coast is the other stakeholders in the Menhaden issue are the recreational fishermen who see Menhaden as a forage, a very important forage base for striped bass, weakfish, bluefish, and the other stakeholders also see Menhaden as a filter feeder that has the potential to, quote, clean up the bay, kind of thing. I think the jury and the science is out on the latter issue, but certainly Menhaden's an important forage species for one of the key species on the East Coast, one of the feature species on the East Coast for recreational fishermen, striped bass. The $64,000 question out there is how many Menhaden are in Chesapeake Bay. We know pretty closely what the industry removes from the bay. Thousands of metric tons from the catch records and the vessel logbooks, but how many Menhaden are actually in there, and then how many striped bass are in there, and then what are the feeding requirements for striped bass while they reside in Chesapeake Bay. So some of the science that's been funded in recent years has been along those tacks to try and get a handle on the abundance or relative abundance of Menhaden in the bay. And so again, the $64,000 question: if you think you know how many Menhaden are in there, you know how many are being removed by the fishery, and maybe you can get an estimate on how many are needed for the striped bass. So that's the way some of the science is angling, how to parse out this big piece of pie that we'd call the Menhaden numbers in Chesapeake Bay.
But they migrate too, right?
Well, that's the big problem with Chesapeake Bay. If it were a farm pond, you could go in and effectively sample, but it's got this thing at the mouth of it called the mouth of the bay, and it's 17 miles across, and the fish come in and go out. There's a lot of ingress and egress. That's where a tagging program might come in, or trying to get a handle on how many come in and how many leave, but they certainly do. They don't all come in and stay. There's ingress and egress during the summer, so spring, fall, and summer. So it's difficult to get that handle on the abundance of fish in the bay to answer those questions. So the science isn't quite caught up to to answering some of these questions that are posed by some of these stakeholders other than the industry.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like there's pressure to politicize the science, or has the scientific community been successful in just straightforward doing research and not allowing political pressure to, I don't know, focus on something you might otherwise not think would be productive to focus on? Or I'm not quite sure what I'm asking here, but
well, we've tried to stay pretty much independent and rely on the science here for our assessments out of Beaufort, and tried to stay out of the political phrase. The political arena lately has been ASMFC, Atlantic States Marine Fish Commission, and most recently the cap on removals from Chesapeake Bay. That cap was voted in year 2005. It was the cap specifics were there was a compromise arrived at last summer, July or August 1 of last year, 06, in which the industry was permitted to take up to 109,000, approximately 109,000 metric tons out of the bay. The cap was originally voted upon as a precautionary instrument to literally put a cap on removals until we got a handle on some of this science, like what's the abundance of fish, menhaden in the bay. So people, I think certain stakeholders were very concerned that Omega, with the increase in prices for their products, the meal and the oil, might expand their operation in Virginia, might double the capacity of the factory, might bring in surplus vessels from the Gulf. So it's a precautionary measure to keep the industry from expanding up in the bay until some of the scientific answers are had. So to biologically argue for a cap would be very difficult. It's hard to, and the number 109,000 metric tons was an average of the previous 5 years on removals from the bay, the 5 years prior to 06. So I don't say it was like throwing darts, but it's difficult to defend 109,000 metric tons versus 100,000 metric tons versus 150. It's a 5-year average. It's a convenient number, but defending a number biologically, I think, would be difficult. Certainly, difficult to defend.
Have they honored that cap?
Yes, last year the removals were considerably less than 109,000 metric tons. There is a provision for underages and overages. If they come in under, then the following year they can take up to 122,000 metric tons. So that they took under the 109 last year, they immediately roll into 122 this year. There's a provision for overages. If this year they would go over, say, the 122 and take 130,000 metric tons, then 8,000 would be lopped off 109 from the next year, 08. The cap the following year, I think, is reset to 109 again. So there are provisions for underages and overages.
One thing, when I was doing my studies on the Menhaden and going to a lot of public hearings, and I was looking at that conflict between sport fishermen and the industry, one thing that struck me was that it seemed like the concern that sport fishermen had was, perhaps I could understand how they would be concerned when you see the operation. It looks like these boats are sucking tremendous amount of fish out of the ocean. But then when the science is presented, it would alleviate, I would think that it would alleviate the concerns of the sport fishermen, because, the fishery is extremely prolific. There's very little bycatch. All those various points that are made, and yet the conflict would rage on despite the science. And I've always had a hard time figuring out why that is. What makes the recreational users downright hostile toward this fishery?
Yeah, a lot of questions there, but it is a relatively clean fishery. The people that have come out against bycatch issues, I think a lot of the bycatch issues have been resolved by bycatch studies. We haven't had one for a while, but every bycatch study I'm aware of has said that the bycatch is really low. On average, bycatch is probably 1 or 2% of the total number of menhaden in the catch. So I don't think the bycatch issue is hammered on that much anymore. The big buzz phrase in Chesapeake Bay in recent years has been localized depletion. I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. There's a Menhaden school. The purse seine boats come, they take the Menhaden school. Yeah, there's a localized depletion because the catch is in the hold of the boat, but the Menhaden vessels in Virginia mainly fish the main stem of the bay. 50% of the catch is beyond 3 miles from shore. They're not by law allowed to fish in the river systems, and they're prohibited from fishing in Maryland waters. So, to me, Maryland is like a giant refuge or a sanctuary. I often tongue-in-cheek say that the Menhaden management is at the forefront of this marine protected area issue, because just about every state except North Carolina and Virginia now are marine protected areas for Menhaden. Right. So again, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but it is. And if you look at the catch information from the logbooks, some years almost 50% of the removals from Chesapeake Bay come from those northern areas up by the fish factory that straddle the Maryland line. And indeed, the boats some weeks will just wait for the fish to come out of Maryland waters and catch them. And it's again, Maryland's a giant refuge for these fish. Mm-hmm. So there's this localized depletion issue, and there's other. I think there's some really honest groups out there that'll tell you that getting to the crux to your question is they just don't want to see Menhaden boats in their backyard. And some of the closures, the state closures north of Virginia are not based on biology or biological reasons. The states will tell you that, and I think it's in the management plan for Atlantic Menhaden, that they just don't like to see them. They call them user conflicts, but they prefer not to have commercial Menhaden vessels near recreational fishing hotspots or recreational vessels. So right. I think that's a lot of it. Is just the imposing figure of the 200-foot vessel and a purse seine and spotter pilots locating these fish.
Right.
So.
Well, I guess we'll wrap it up because I know you're
Sure.
busy and everything, but I wanted to ask you, what will happen to your data collection program should all the factories close? What do you think you would do?
Well, the Atlantic is I guess the Reedville factory is the factory that it would be, if I had to say, in danger of losing some of its traditional fishing grounds. If Chesapeake Bay, Virginia portion were to be closed to them, I'm not sure that factory would survive. That would be the end of probably the reduction fishery on the east coast of the U.S. That said, there's a growing bait fishery for Menhaden on the East Coast. The bait landings have been becoming more important as the reduction fishery has shrunk, i.e. Beaufort Fisheries has closed and other factories before it. The landings have gone down, total landings, and the bait landings have become relatively more important. Bait landings on the East Coast used to represent, we thought, about 10% of the total Menhaden landings. The last 5 or 6 years, it's grown to probably 15-18% of the total landings, maybe 20% on a given year. So there's this, but the total bait landings are growing a bit slower than that percentage would suggest. But it still seems to be growing, and there's a big demand for bait, not only for blue crab, lobster. Some of it's shipped to the Gulf Coast for crawfish, but there's also a big market in chum for sport fishermen and sport fishing bait, whole Menhaden. So that facet is growing. I think that will require monitoring, and the Gulf fishery is in relatively, I think, relatively good shape. We have had a stock assessment come out in January of '07 that said the fishery was not overfished. There's a little bit of concern about recruitment down there, but we think recruitment is driven more by oceanographic and meteorological conditions than it is by the fishery. Mm-hmm. So I think that the Gulf fishery will probably be around for quite a while, and the demand for fish meal is to me at an all-time high. So I think they'll be around, and the Gulf fishery, on average, it can be 2 to 3 times the total landings landed on the Atlantic. So it has superseded, probably since the late 70s, it has superseded the Atlantic as being the more important facet of the two fisheries, Gulf versus Atlantic Menhaden.
Okay. So. My last question, Joe, and I forgot to touch on this, but could you tell me a little bit about just, where you went to school and what was your research when you were doing your studies? Was it Menhaden?
I went to a little undergraduate school in Philadelphia, St. Joseph's. We're known for the basketball team, I guess, nationally. But I went off to William and Mary to get my master's. I worked at VIMS there in the mid '70s on all things on cow-nose rays, of all things, which is another species that's in vogue lately for eating a lot of scallops, or allegedly eating a lot of bay scallops in North Carolina Sound. So it's kind of, I live in interesting times. Very neat and controversial animals, cow-nose rays and Menhaden. So I left. I got a degree from William and Mary and left there. My first job was in Charleston with the state of South Carolina. I was there for 4 years and moved up to the Beaufort lab in '83 working on Menhaden. So this will be my 25th year at Beaufort.
Are you glad you got into Menhaden?
Yes. It's a neat fishery. It's just fascinating characters, tremendously data-rich fishery, and it's been an excellent group of people to work with here. The assessment people, the entire Menhaden program here, just a wonderful group of people. We really get along well, and hope to be here quite a few more years. So.
Great. Well, is there anything you'd like to add? Did I forget to ask you about anything critical?
No, I think we covered quite a bit.
Okay.
I think we did, but again, I miss Beaufort Fisheries and seeing those characters. And like you mentioned before the interview, those people have scattered and probably not be in the same place at the same time ever again. Just was a real big loss around here for me, anyway.
Yeah, where do all those stories go now?
Yeah, Yeah, it's just tremendous decades and decades of stories. So and could be lost.
And to me, what was sad is when that factory closed, it was to no fanfare at all. When it was such an important part of this area, you know.
It fed a lot of families, 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. Really important to the economy of this place.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
gone.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.